All right, I think we might as well get started. We have an hour here, and people come in, and uh, so good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second Spotlight event hosted by the Humboldt Institute for Internet Society and as part of the DSA Research Network project, which is funded by Stiftung Mercator. We will be discussing disinformation and regulation in the context of the German elections today with Anne-Kathrin Vatola and Felix Kate, who I'll introduce properly in a minute. My name is John Albert. I'm a researcher at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam. I work on the DSA Observatory, which is a hub for expert discussion, debate around the DSA. We also publish regular analysis that you can check out if that's of interest to you. And before we dive into the conversation with Anne-Kathrin and Felix, I just want to first emphasize to everyone there, and I don't see many faces. Most people sort of have their video off. That's completely fine. Just want to say this is, intended to be an open conversation, not just a panel of experts talking at you. So I'll keep an eye on the chat for your questions and leave some time for Q&A, of course. So please do feel free to participate. We'd love to hear your questions and perspectives in this discussion. I should also mention a bit of housekeeping that the conversation is being recorded. So, keep your camera off if that's an issue for you. Otherwise, we hope that's all right. And yeah, so to dive in, just a little scene setting. We're talking about, again, disinformation in the German elections, and specifically, of course, the role of online platforms in all of this. A few dimensions that I'm sure we'll be talking about today. First, we have covert disinformation, Russian influence campaigns using fake news sites, AI-generated content, influencers online to spread false narratives, targeting German politicians, playing to migration fears, and so on. We also have overt disinformation, or perhaps we call it propaganda. Elon Musk openly engaging with Alice Weidel, personally amplifying far-right narratives and conspiracies to millions of users on his personal platform. And then we have all the open questions around regulation and enforcement. The Digital Services Act was supposed to bring accountability to online platforms, is supposed to when it comes to disinformation. But the chaos of the recent Romanian elections raised real questions about platforms and regulators and if they're equipped to manage disinformation threats as they're emerging in real time around elections. And we have a slew of ongoing investigations into platforms around how they're managing systemic risks. And it's quite unclear at this point where exactly the Commission can or will draw the line on violations. So that's my scene setting or my attempt at it. And to help us unpack this and much more, I have two great panelists, discussants, whatever we call you today for this chat, Anne-Kathrin Vatola and Felix Kate. Dr. Anne-Kathrin Vatola, excuse me, is a senior researcher and project lead for the DSA Research Network at the Hague, set up to monitor and improve the implementation of the DSA within an interdisciplinary research alliance. She has a multidisciplinary background in linguistics, cultural studies, media studies, and educational sciences. She completed her doctorate at Hamburg University of Technology, and her research focuses on communication in the context of digitality at the interface of society, technology, and education. And Felix Kate is a senior fellow at Stiftung Mercator. Hello, Felix, a policy advisor and a technology expert who frequently advises the EU Commission and other public institutions on digital policy. He started his career as a researcher and journalist. Felix and I have that in common. We started off in journalism and has covered digital democracy for outlets such as Süddeutsche Zeitung and Politico. And during his time at the EU Commission and European External Action Service in Brussels, advanced EU strategy for countering digital threats in collaboration with partners such as NATO, the G7. He's worked on policy files as the European Democracy Action Plan and the DSA. So forgive me for the mouthful, but there we are. We have everyone introduced and we can get the conversation going. I will hand it over to Anne-Kathleen first. So we're using this term disinformation. It's a useful and perhaps even necessary shorthand, but it's also a totally convoluted concept that can mean so many different things. So, and to different people. So to just get the conversation started, what does disinformation mean to you, in the context of these upcoming elections? What do you think sort of the major issues are?
Thank you so much, John, for this lovely introduction, and hello to all of you. So happy to have you join us for this really a discussion. It's a discussion around disinformation and the German elections. So, John, you started asking me what is disinformation, and that is a very tricky question, to be honest, because even in research, there is no one definition. The one that most people go with, it's false or misleading information that is being shared with a malicious intent. So it's not about somebody sharing false or misleading information who just doesn't know any better, but it's really about using that kind of information to manipulate people. Now, that might seem like a good distinction, but then again, how do we prove, or how do we actually verify this kind of intent, right? That is the first thing that's really, really tough to do. And we see that when we do research on disinformation, also in terms of the German elections or elections in general. One thing I want to highlight in the beginning is that while there's a lot of public discourse, not just among researchers, but in mainstream media as well, on the role of disinformation for the German elections. And one thing that I feel is falling short a lot of the times is the distinction between we have disinformation and like the impact of disinformation on XYZ, in this case, the German election. So, we know that we have disinformation, and that disinformation exists. Especially, you mentioned that in your introduction. There are targeted campaigns. We have the very prominent example of the doppelganger campaign, which is a disinformation campaign coming out of Russia. And in the last round, so to speak, they targeted Friedrich Merz, the chancellor candidate for the Christian Democratic Party. And that was revealed. They did that massively, like at the end of December 2024 until, February 2025. So right until now. So we do know that we have disinformation. What we don't know is, or what we know little about, is how many people are actually exposed to that. So that is a huge difference. So we're jumping from we have disinformation to there is this kind of effect, right? So we don't know much about like the exposure rates. There are some studies, we've seen some studies. If we look at the US election context, there were some studies about like exposure and all of that. But what we don't know is if, and if so, to what extent disinformation impacts voting decisions, right? And that is, I'm not even sure that that's possible to verify, because I mean, as I'm sure all of you know, like voting and the decision who to vote for is such a complex decision to make, and isolating like the role of disinformation on that complex decision, um, I'm not sure that is even possible. And I think that is kind of one of the main points that kind of distorts the discussion around disinformation, because it just it makes the problem too easy. It kind of depicts an easy problem. If disinformation is the problem to our elections, then we get rid of the disinformation and problem solved. But we see that the problem is a much bigger one than that. But I don't want to take up all the space, so I'll just leave it at that for now.
I think that's quite a difficult starting point, of course, that it's this concept is quite convoluted. And so, Felix, how would you like to respond to that? I mean, I wrote down here we don't really understand the causation, right? This is, I think, what Anne-Catherine was getting at in terms of disinformation affecting voters' perceptions, behaviors. But we know that it's part of the picture, and we know that from a regulatory perspective, we're concerned about it. Uh, but is that can't be the standard, right? For doing something about it is causation. So what are we doing here?
What are we doing, John? Uh,
Exactly.
do you mean what I think we should be doing, or what that you, for instance, and others have been doing? Or
Well,
um,
I don't know that I want to start off by asking you to explain, the DSA and its many provisions in terms of, what is expected of platforms to
mhm,
tackle disinformation. But I guess, just giving us like a snapshot of where we are, in real time here, for example, like
mhm,
that the
mhm,
Bundesnetzagentur ran the stress test recently with many, major platforms to look at if they're prepared to deal
mhm,
with potential risks and threats around
mhm.
the German elections. So, like, just giving us that snapshot, sort of where do we stand and what is being done?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, first of all, of course, for having me. I do think that disinformation is a terribly ill-defined concept. And I like to stick a little bit to the idea or the concept of disinformation that informed the first like EU work or strategy making on this issue, and that I believe we should stick to, and that is disinformation is an authoritarian influence strategy. Disinformation is basically what happens when authoritarians open their mouths. It's a constant discursive attempt to reframe democratic institutions as tyranny, to reframe media, professional journalism as fake news, to basically reframe any government action as censorship or the doings of corrupt elites, self-serving elites. And the intention, of course, of all of that is to create, as we're seeing right now in the US, with Elon swinging the wrecking ball on US government. The intention, of course, is to create, do you say impunity, right, in English? um, for authoritarian actors themselves to do precisely what they're alleging others are doing. So that's basically very like basic. It's like a child's or a narcissist like argumentation tactics. Basically, you just accuse the other one of precisely what you're intending to do. We're seeing that, for instance, a nice example, this very like infamous and well-established conspiracy theory or disinformation theme of the Great Replacement, where they're alleging that obscure democratic elites are planning to replace our population and engineer whatever kind of basically turn us all into trans people or whatever the rhetoric is. And the only ones, if we look at it, who are actually intending to replace and reshape our population are, of course, far-right extremists and authoritarians who are planning to deport millions of people from Germany, from the US, with by violent means. Same with this like whole free speech BS, these narratives of censorship. The only ones who are now evidently have a censorship agenda are the Trump and Musk government and authoritarians around the world. But this is kind of the strategy. I believe that disinformation is creating impunity for authoritarian government by blurring the boundaries between democracy and autocracy, basically. And this is something they have been doing, the Kremlin has been doing, the AfD in Germany has been doing, of course, the MAGA movement in the US have been doing for years now, for many years. And I think it stuck. It really has reshaped to an extent public discourse. Um, and on the one hand, that's because some of these narratives they have been spreading were particularly successful, but it's also because they have become so much more powerful and better resourced. And that is in parts because they no longer only own like a bunch of troll factories like the Kremlin used to, that would like spin up fake news about refugees allegedly like raping, killing German girls like they used to. And there we can see, by the way, how that narrative has been successful because that's kind of the view that a big part of German public discourse seems to be subscribing to now. But the vilification and securitization of groups in society. But it's also, of course, because they are now owning so much and directly controlling of the communication infrastructure in democracy. So I think what we need to talk when we talk about disinformation or authoritarian influence, now it's no longer just a problem of a bunch of social media posts that get amplified by algorithms on platforms. It's that the platforms themselves have become the influence vehicle or the tool of influence. We see that with X, of course, to an extent, potentially at least with TikTok, of course, for China. And now with this growing alignment between US tech companies and authoritarian Trump government, that might be a whole new ball game, let's say, for all of these counter disinformation efforts.
So when you say, Felix, that disinformation is an authoritarian strategy, and then what you've laid out here is that it's a strategy that has clearly had a lot of success. I mean, when we started, I think when disinformation really entered, the sort of mainstream discourse in a way that I recognized it, and I think also, you could just look at the number of times that the word disinformation, fake news, these kinds of things appeared in the media. Like we have a massive spike, obviously, in 2016, and it's sort of this sort of rising awareness of the fact that, oh no, like we have this sort of fringe, what we think of as like fringe conspiracies and ideas and narratives, which
Mm.
have become mainstream. But now there's been a shift from mainstream into power, actually, and then, wielding this from a position of power. And I think this is, obviously in the German context specifically, like this is highly concerning. But also we see sort of this right-wing populist playbook, which has had success, which is being, just replicated, and at this point also is, mutually supportive, right? I mean, using make Germany great again, like echoing Trump's campaign slogan and, broadcasting Elon Musk at campaign rallies and so on. So that I think also you mentioned sort of the censorship narrative, which evidently is, the only one censoring, as you said, um, are those who are critical of it, and yet that seems to have become like quite a sort of a durable narrative, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword, it seems, from the perspective of disinformation researchers and the idea of fact checking and everything that to call out a piece of something or to label it as disinformation or identify it as such can be viewed as a political act, and those who do it as political actors. So, Anne-Catherine, I wonder what you think of that and what we should make of that.
Yeah, I mean, especially to the last point, if we look at, Alice Weidel was recently at a major German talk show Sunday night. And in that talk show, it was said, tomorrow we're going to publish a fact checking of everything that you said. And of course, there was no reaction from her, but because, fact checking is mostly done after the fact. And we all know that from, just regular gossip that, the first piece of information stays. And So that is the first part that everybody who hears that kind of disinformation and the narratives that Felix also talked about doesn't also hear the fact check version of that kind of information. So that is the first problem. And the second one is that where like this disinformation narratives, they're built into truth, right? It's not like a whole new version of reality that is being created with these narratives, but it's the disinformation is embedded into truth, and which makes it so kind of relatable and so close for us, and also so hard to distinguish at times, especially if you're not a researcher or dealing with this. And then also, what these disinformation narratives target are are emotions. So we're not talking about rational arguments. We're talking a lot about, yeah, Felix, you mentioned the narrative of, all the refugees are raping our children. And that is not it's not targeted at a rational argument and saying, does it really happen? What are the numbers? But more of a, oh my God, what is happening? It's targeting emotions and countering emotions with facts. It doesn't match. And that is why, of course, Alice Weidel in this talk show, she doesn't care if the fact checking is happening the next day because the narratives are happening on different levels. And maybe just I also had one thing that I wanted to comment on what Felix said about the point of disinformation. What is the point? And it's part of an authoritarian strategy. Also, the point is sowing distrust, right? It's about sowing distrust in public media, in social cohesion, right? That is the point of it, and it kind of building this us versus them narrative, um, it does feed into the fear that people have because we are in a public crisis, and of course, those kinds of narratives are targeting that general fear that a lot of people have, and we see that in studies. There was a study coming out today from the R&V insurance company. They polled, I think, 1,000 Germans, what are their biggest fear? And 74% said, they had the fear of the division of society, which is interesting. Then, you know, especially the far right, they come in and saying, we want to unite Germany. And that is exactly the problem that we have that Felix so beautifully described, you know, promoting a narrative that you are actually working against.
Yeah. Felix, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
And I think that was very well laid out. In addition, maybe because you asked about one of these very pervasive narratives or framing strategies of censorship and free speech. Um, I think it's just so important because I've also wondered a lot, like, why does this resonate so widely with people who obviously, on a rational level, at least know that we're living um, in democracies? And I think the paradox here is really that on the one hand, the opportunities for self-expression, for free speech, also thanks perhaps to social media or social media companies that we like to criticize a lot, and rightly so. But the opportunities for free speech are more ample and more widely accessible than ever before. More people can speak freely than ever before without any form of censorship. And I think what this leads to is that dominant positions, dominant perspectives, perhaps often white male perspectives, are more frequently confronted with dissent or with alternative realities, alternative perspectives. They are more frequently challenged. And I think this is in essence democratic. However, perhaps because there is a bit of a lacking ability to tolerate dissent and to engage constructively, this dissent is often misperceived as censorship. But just because somebody disagrees with you that is not the same as stopping you from speaking. It's as simple as that. So I think on the one hand, we have more free speech than ever, but perhaps society isn't always mature enough yet to handle these opportunities well. And then a lot of people feel censored, but they're not.
Yeah. And this opens the door for a democratic move toward authoritarianism, one that
Exactly. That's
accepts
kind of
freely. Yeah.
paradox.
What I'm,
Maybe, yeah,
sorry, what I'm also wondering, like, if the if we need to question how the reporting on disinformation, talking about disinformation, and not just, among research communities or civil society, but it is part of the mainstream media, public discourse, right? If that also leads to the perception and kind of feeds into like the goals kind of these disinformation campaigns that we've talked about, sowing distrust and all of that, because the more we talk about it, and we see that in studies on the perception of disinformation, right? A lot of people say it's a huge problem. But I'm just wondering, because we don't know anything or little about the exposure, is that a problem because they've encountered it, or is it a problem because it's being made a big problem, right? And it's kind of similar to, I don't know if you remember the studies when we had the refugee movement. I'm not going to call it crisis, the refugee movement. I think it was in 2016 as well. Um, a lot of the studies show that many people were concerned. And then when asked, how many refugees have you actually met? It didn't correlate. So I'm just wondering, this constant talking about election or disinformation is going to have a negative effect on our elections, and disinformation is going to undermine our electoral integrity. If that also, instead of, actually being done to raise awareness, if that is actually having the a contrary effect and actually, strengthening that kind of direction of distrust.
yeah. I mean, I think the way I hear you making that point, Ann-Kathleen, tell me if I'm understanding correctly, but it's just that the whole sort of disinformation narrative or as a concept are being thrown around uh, constantly, that many people are put off by it essentially, and it doesn't like have meaning for them, or they feel that they're the target of some kind of institutional conspiracy against them, something like that. I mean, the cabal, so to speak. Am I am I understanding you right? You're kind of nodding. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And also, by talking about it, we're raising awareness, but at the same time, I'm not sure if we're making like, especially this question of the causality between disinformation and elections.
Yeah.
If we're putting that on a different level just by, having that in the news and in the media all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that causality is the standard necessarily that we are going for in the first order, but maybe that's a good like segue to talking about just sort of the demands that you have for, better evidence about what's going on the platforms, how information is flowing. And part of that is, getting into the kind of transparency and accountability mechanisms that are in the DSA. And that's, on the one hand, you have responsibilities on the platforms themselves to do more to manage risks, such as, the spread of disinformation. And at the same time, you have certain, transparency requirements, including vis-a-vis external researchers. And there was an interesting, suit in Germany, civil society organizations demanding access to sort of public data on X, which currently is inaccessible to third parties to scrutinize. And I wonder, Felix, you intimated earlier you have some hot takes. I wonder, I wonder what you think about this, and kind of if you could put that into context a bit, that case.
If I can put it into context, of course, first of all, congrats to those civil society um, friends and colleagues who scored that victory, that initial victory. I think that data access continues to be critical from a whole host of perspectives. Um, I wonder, to be perfectly honest with you, if you really need more data access to understand what authoritarians are doing on the platforms. I feel like it's become very much in your face, and we also have to acknowledge that this kind of authoritarian propaganda or disinformation, whatever we like to call it, has long spilled over from platforms into broadcast media, into TV and radio, where I think to an extent we're seeing a normalization currently of far-right extremist rhetoric, for instance. So I sometimes wonder, do we still need like forensic analyses to understand that the Kremlin and AfD and Trump and MAGA are doing bad things on the platforms? Probably not. I think from a whole other range of perspectives, it is still incredibly important to have it. And I think anyone challenging Musk in particular at the moment is incredibly courageous and brave because we've seen, of course, all of these threats of litigation and actual bogus litigation happening that may be bogus, but still is simply too expensive to keep up with for most civil society organizations. Can basically just be, I think, seen as a silencing tactic. And yeah, and there is that, there is the threats of litigation, then there is the actual harassment, the online harassment, the calling out, the dog whistling, all of that. Um, and here, what we're seeing, I think, also with how Musk has reshaped the platform, but also on other platforms, is really like something that would probably cause Habermas a meltdown. But it's really like the laws of the strongest, like brute force is kind of reshaping how public discourse works because it is the most powerful and strongest to have the most reach because they are the most powerful and the strongest and not because they have the best arguments. So anyone challenging the Musk Trump kind of oligarchy right now, like these NGOs did, they deserve a lot of credit for it.
Cheers to that. Tom, we have a question from Tom. You want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
I already have actually, but hi everybody. Thank you so much. My mind is already spinning slightly outside of my original question by what you've just said. So I hope that I've got permission to make this slightly about myself, or rather the archetype that I'm representing. So maybe like John did earlier, I'm going to set the scene very quickly so that you understand where the question is coming from. I would say that I'm a semi well-informed and privileged by the very informed social bubble that I swim in, and also academically backgrounded person. So I have a certain resilience to disinformation and ability to spot it. And I'm still asking myself about, okay, like Felix just said, we know it's there. And we know that it's a tool for influence of authoritarian co-conspirators. And also to Anki's question earlier, we know it's there, but now what? And so specifically the now what for me. So the research that you're talking about and also the DSA, what is the sort of impact pathway that you're thinking about towards civil society members like me? Like I know that it's there, but now what can I do to A, protect my brain, not only now when the election cycle is on, but over time, because disinformation works over longer periods, not just now that we're electing in Germany. What do I say to my friends and family? Like, how can I make them aware that this is happening not only on social media, but also in the general media? Because if we follow the money, like who owns what kind of media group, there are financial influences that exceed social media. So I know that this is the biggest question on the planet, so there's no specific direction I'm expecting an answer to be formulated. I just wonder, when you break it down to me as a voter, and people that are less privileged with sort of the information nexus that there's women, what do we do? I hope that I'm allowed to make it this much about myself, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Of course. Do you want to direct that to to anyone in particular, or just lofting it
I,
out there?
I can
No,
just
I would
start.
never be this. I would never be that cruel. So, Ann-Kathrin, if you're volunteering, then
Yeah,
go
sure.
ahead.
Thanks. And I think it's a great question, but also the biggest challenge, right? What can we do? I think just from a mental health perspective, taking breaks from all of this is important. And just put that out there because I guess that with the January that we've all had the sense of being overwhelmed by all the information that is happening, all the new development that we see, also in terms of how the platforms are changing. Felix, you mentioned that, looking at the platform infrastructures, we see Musk like actively using X to promote his own personal points of view. We see, and we talked about this in the last spotlight, we see like the metas move from fact checking to community notes. So there's a lot of things happening that they want one of the things that their goal is, and that links back to what Felix was saying about, Musk's strategy of silencing, leaving people overwhelmed, kind of puts them in a position of, hopelessness and also not knowing what to do. And that is the point of disinformation as well, I would say. So take breaks whenever you feel like you need to. We can't always be engaged all the time. And the second thing is, you know, if we, so be, of course, the same things, be critical of what you see and what you read and all of that. But also, one thing that is very important also, if we talk about platform infrastructures, the loudest voices aren't always representative of the majority of people. Like if we look at in Germany, we had this massive, massive demonstrations, right? People taking to the streets to stand up for democracy and not and kind of make a point, a very, very loud point, but a peaceful point, countering like this whole far right rhetoric. So that is one thing that you can do, get engaged where you can. And it's just, looking at, and that goes back to what John was asking in terms of what do we do for research? Like we need to do research on the platform infrastructures, right? I mean, that's going back to what I said in the beginning about the exposure. We need to understand like how are the mechanisms working? Because they're the loudest and the most distributed means they're part of the majority. And being aware that that is part of the strategy, that they want to make you feel like, you know, you're outnumbered. Does that help? Was that specific enough?
I mean, could go on, but thank you for that. But I see that Felix was getting ready as well, so just gonna.
And I might just
I'm
say,
sorry. So
sorry, just if I could quickly, like I think Tom, what I heard in your question was very much like a sort of a bottom up type of concern, you know? I mean, bottom up, starting from the self, it's very personal. And I have a tendency to think of these things top down, looking at the regulation and the regulators and sort of the standoffs that they're having with the platforms and what can be done there. And certainly both are very important frames. But yeah, appreciate you raising that. Felix, did you want to say something?
I was just gonna answer or try to answer maybe. I'm not gonna answer anything, but offer some thoughts maybe. And so what I do want to say is that government institutions or regulators in Brussels are not going to save us. I don't think the DSA is going to save us from the authoritarian tide. And I don't think any like government communication campaigns praising themselves for their policy successes, like some cute numbers of inflation reduction or reductions in student loans or whatever. I don't know. It's not gonna save us. And I also frankly think this whole like language of democracy and human rights, shockingly but truly, nobody wants to hear it. I don't, that's really my impression. Like beyond this very, let's say, like elitist bubble that perhaps we have to call ourselves, I don't really feel like anyone wants to hear it. And I also think like even worse, it is not just that it doesn't really stick or appeal to people. It's even that they see it, that they have increasingly negative perceptions on this terminology of democracy and human rights. They feel like it's basically a Luxusproblem. And as we said before, because of the years also of framing, but also, of course, very legitimate concerns about public policy delivery, they feel like this is all like a self-serving, detached clubs that is prioritizing the well-being of small minorities over um, basically the big collective or whatever. So I indeed think that facts and figures or like established like pro-democracy terminology isn't really gonna help. And you asked, Tom, that's how I understood your question, like how do you talk to your auntie or whatever who is consuming a lot of that stuff on Telegram or on WhatsApp or wherever. And I just think that what we should do, like basically like with like when you're anxious or like perhaps like a psychotherapist would, is to try and identify and understand not how false that information maybe that they're sharing, but what their underlying needs are, emotional needs of reassurance, connection, validation, being seen, being acknowledged. Um, so that's probably, I think the service that we can all do is just to listen as many times as possible, actively. And while we may profoundly disagree with what people are saying, at least make them feel like we hear them and that their emotions are valid, even if they're talking shit. So I think that's basically um, how I would try to go about it.
So facts don't matter, but emotional truths do.
I think
Or
truth doesn't matter. Emotions do.
yeah.
Well,
Um,
can I just facts don't matter. I don't think so because I think one important thing that I personally like to do is, if I see like disinformation on social media, I comment on that because it gets, a lot of things, a lot of the times the truth gets whatever the truth is, gets drowned out. Um, and we see that. And we see a lot of people, the lurkers just, reading it, but, not agreeing, but, silently disagreeing. And so one thing that I would like to do is if I say something, correct it. Just for, the small chance that somebody else is reading, I don't know, a post, a comment, and but also at the same time seeing, a counter statement to that.
is this an
Not
argument for community notes on Kathleen?
Is this censorship?
It's not censorship. I'm just offering a different perspective. I'm not censoring the other person. But just
Joking.
yeah, I'm totally with you on, we can't convince people with arguments. It's about emotions. And, the far right and the oligarchy, they have mastered the art of tapping into people's emotions. And so we're not going to counter that with facts. I completely agree. But at the same time, we shouldn't just let like distorted information just be, not do anything about it if we come across that. And I think with a lot of the people or the majority of users, not being active, but really letting it slide. And like active usage often stems again from emotions. Whatever the emotion is, often it's a negative emotion, and just offering a counter viewpoint, I think, is a good idea as well.
But what you're basically suggesting to do, and of course, I agree with you that democracy doesn't work without facts. But what you're basically doing is you're fact checking people in private capacity. Um, and how do you think or like reflect on that kind of backlash that with parts of people online or parts of the population, or even like Kubicki here in Germany, FDP politician, and others, this will inevitably have, who are like, for me, completely paradoxically, but who are equating fact checking with censorship, and who will, and then don't you feel like some often it will actually increase polarization?
It depends on how you frame it, I would say. If you go, and I would completely agree, if you go ahead and say, no, that's bullshit, let me offer you the truth, of course, that is not helping anybody, but kind of, and, I've built kind of, I've done that for years, so you get better at it. Kind of get the people where they're at and kind of, just show them casually introducing different viewpoints. Um, and not attacking other people, saying you are wrong. Because yes, that is a kind of a you are wrong, I am right, and it doesn't bring us closer together if we do that all the time, which is which is kind of what fact checking does, right? Not saying that we shouldn't fact check. Um, and on your question, John, if I'm a fan of community notes, in theory, yes. The problem is, I mean, community notes take a long time, right?
Mm.
So, I mean,
I,
the ideal solution that would be that there's no disinformation to begin with.
I I wonder if you've had this experience because you're talking now about not just, how do you talk to the people who are close to you, like Tom, raised this before. And I think when it comes to somebody who we have a personal relationship with, you always have an in there in terms of, discussing with them and also being humbled in talking to them because, our we only know what we think we know, right? But when it comes to being engaged online and doing what you're proposing, Uncut Clean, fact checking someone in a private capacity, even if you attempt to do it with all sensitivity in the world, or if you just post anything, and especially if you're a woman posting something online, you open yourself up to being targeted. And there are people, online, we know this, people have no qualms, many, about saying awful, vile things and trying to get an emotional response out of you, which, creates this whatever adversarial feedback loop. And, Felix asked the question. So I'm just sort of in a long form way saying, doesn't this increase polarization? I think it's something that we all struggle with to some extent. But I don't know if you've had this experience also, of being sort of harassed online.
Yes, yes, I've had. Not in the worst way that you can imagine, but yes, just in, being active in like the comments. But that is what we have the DSA for, right? And I mean, yes, I am a big advocate of freedom of speech, but freedom of speech ends where it interfere interferes with another person's human rights, right? So if I'm being harassed, targeted, whatever online, we have the DSA and we can report content. And that is what I do. Not saying I want to, contribute to polarization. And I always follow that up saying, I reported this because this is a violation against whatever. I'm not quoting laws, but, more normal terms. But that is where I draw the line, Differences of opinion, totally fine. You know, threatening somebody, or worse, that is what we have the DSA for.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you bringing up the DSA and that we do have these mechanisms in place, and hopefully, users know that they have this kind of available to them. Tom, you wanted to ask a follow-up.
Perhaps it's a question, perhaps it's a statement, perhaps I'm slightly jealous that I'm not formally part of the panel, though not qualified to. Um, what I don't know who the audience is that is sitting here, but I find it really interesting what both Felix and Ann-Kathrin have just spoken to, which is how do we lift this very lofty academic conversation that can sometimes feel like there's disinformation everywhere. These are the actors, these are the acts, these are the platforms. into a space where the enforcers of culture and of our community and how we are together in a democracy, which is everybody, can act on these insights, right? So how do you channel this down to us? And I think us as audience members listen to this now, and we have a duty to try and carry some of these things forward. And so I really appreciate you taking the time also to give some. Felix spoke more so about how are we human with one another and create community, but this we also do in a digital sphere. So Ann-Katrine's, approach is very powerful. And what it does for me is it lifts me or people like me, it can lift us out of this apathy of disinformation is everywhere. I have no influence and power, so I'm just going to say whatever because I can't act on this. So giving us with your research a sense of and this work a sense of agency that actually we can contribute in this overwhelmingly complex thing is for me a very powerful output of sitting here in this meeting with you guys. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tom. And I think I'll just circle back again to, what Anne-Catherine said, like about, that's what we have the DSA for. I think sometimes the discussion, especially from like a US media perspective, where you have like Mark Zuckerberg coming out and saying, oh, the EU is institutionalizing all these censorship laws. There tends to be sort of this very high level idea that, the EU is trying to censor speech, when in fact, if you look at the different kinds of mechanisms that are in the DSA, Felix said the DSA isn't going to save us in some kind of, talking about sort of this authoritarian trend we're seeing. And I think, certainly we shouldn't expect the regulation alone to save us, but it does give, for example, users the possibility to, if they've had a piece of content blocked, they have new pathways now to alert, the platform potentially go to an out of court body to dispute this. They have some kind of recourse available to them with the platforms. And likewise, when it comes to, flagging content, we're meant to have sort of more transparency around this to make sure that platforms are actually, doing a decent job of this. So uh, it's not like a snap of the fingers going to solve all of the problems that we have in front of us, but at least in theory, it does give individuals a bit more agency when it comes to their online experience. And to the extent that it doesn't, I would argue, we need to challenge that.
While I agree with that, I think one issue that we're facing is that the DSA was made in a time where we could assume that, the platforms were complying with, working towards a common goal and all of that. And with especially what we see in the US right now, we see like a change and a lot of, the platforms taking on this narrative of, we don't want to have censorship and all of that. And so with the DSA, we have two levels, especially if we talk about content moderation. Of course, one, we have like the threshold of what is legal and what is illegal, in terms of a differentiation. And the second one is we have in terms of what is accepted via the community guidelines, which are set out by the platforms, right? So it's their interpretation of what is okay and what is not okay. So while I totally agree with you, John, I do think that, that can be problematic if unchallenged, because then we leave like the interpretation of what kind of, Tom said that beautifully, what kind of culture do we want on those information communication spaces? We leave that up to private companies who, as they've shown us, don't have like always have like people's well-being, as their main goal, but their own money and power and whatever they want to work towards.
People's attention is rather than their well-being. Yeah.
I was also going to say that I don't think it's the community guidelines that shape the culture on the platforms. I think what shapes the culture on the platforms is the dominant business model and the attention economy. And I think it's that by design, what these platforms are built to do is to trigger our reptile brains and to, well, turn us basically into anxious, addicted people who spend as much time as possible, as we all know, on these platforms. I'm not going to share my daily screen time here. Um, so to keep us available to digital advertising for as much time as possible. So I think that is the true problem, and I don't think that we can like for me, the policy changes that Zuckerberg announced, for instance, on removing protections for women, trans people, migrants, those were horrible, but mostly as because of their symbolism, which I think normalizes and legitimizes hate in the eyes of many who felt like they were being censored before. But I don't think that the actual policy changes themselves will matter that much. I think it's the broader signal that it sends. Um, and I completely forgot what else I was going to say, but maybe that was a statement already.
But we don't know, right? I mean, I mean, we do have the transparency report, we have the risk assessment reports under the GSA. So I think it's worth doing research on, is there an effect of, those restrictions or, ground rules have been modified by Meta, for example. How does it impact in terms of, how many more of these instances do we have? I'm not even sure if if Meta would provide that information, but that would be interesting to see, also to know better, to know more about the role of the community notes, community guidelines play in,
Mhm.
shaping the culture.
That is interesting. And the last thing, because I love to end everything on a very dark and negative note, no, but there was you said that the DSA was written at a time when there was a presumption of cooperation. And I think that this is true, but that it was naive because I was in the EU institutions at the time. I don't think the assumption that platforms will be happily cooperating towards the shared goal of like civic integrity and healthy discourse, I think that assumption was never justified. I think they never cared. They never gave a damn. We had Myanmar, we had Cambridge Analytica, Brexit. We had research paper after research paper showing how they failed to do anything on any type of horrible content on the platforms. We had Frances Haugen showing how Meta, Facebook, Instagram were fully aware of how their products were harming children, for instance, and they never cared. There was always a number of lobbyists who had this very like hard job, I think, of creating this impression that they were happy to cooperate. But yeah, I think that illusion really crumbled, of course. Finally, one might add now with the Trump inauguration and this open alignment.
Which brings us to the present moment we find ourselves in, which is spannend, to say the least. It is now 6 p.m. I want to thank Felix and Ann-Kathrin for this, and all of you for attending. Tom for the questions you raised and sort of bringing another register to this discussion. And I think keep a lookout if you're interested in these talks. The Hague will keep organizing them. I think this is the second in a series, and yeah. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great evening.